All right, I want to welcome everyone. We're delighted to have some guests with us from both the Board of Ed, the Education Department, Neil, and from the Board of Selectmen. So we appreciate you guys joining us tonight. I'll call the meeting to order, and let's begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. And to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So our primary objective tonight is to talk about debt forecasting, debt service, debt modeling, trying to help all of us have a better appreciation for the levers that affect this very important part of our annual budgeting process, especially as we look forward to major projects that both Board of Ed and things that the town wants to do. We often talk about this in terms of debt service caps and debt outstanding and our triple bond rating and the relative affordability of our town to surrounding towns, the cost of real estate, all of that. And what we're trying to do tonight is pull a lot of this together and show a model that can be used to help us determine how much we can afford, how much we can spend, and the various impacts that it has. Ronald Reagan, among others, used to say, "It doesn't. There's no limit to what you can accomplish as long as you don't spend a lot of time worrying about who takes credit for it." I want to make sure that everybody understands, though, that two people get a lot of credit for the work today. Lisa and Amy, who put the modeling together, really spent a lot of detailed time on this. And they had the help of our outside bond consultant, Barry, who will be presenting to us as well. I think it's also important to remember that we're not trying to form judgments about anybody's wants and wishes on this. What we're really trying to do is fulfill our job as the Board of Finance, which is to help communicate, on the one hand, the impact of decisions that we as a town collectively make on the taxpayers and our ability to pay our bills and stay solvent. But equally important is to give the budget makers, which is the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed, some help in what how the projects that you want to do, near term, intermediate term, and long term, will impact all of that. And to that end, we hope that we can have, as always, congenial, interactive conversation. We may not at the end agree on what is the right answer for that these things spit out in terms of mill rates and taxes and other concerns, but we'll have the same template and tool box that we can use to assess each of our positions in that hopefully healthy dialogue. One of the important things that we thought we should do was bring in Barry Bernabe today to help us understand impact of our budgets and our debt service on our very important bond rating. And so Barry has very graciously prepared a presentation that we'll use as the basis to start off this discussion. When we're done with Barry's presentation, then we'll look at some impacts on the modeling that Amy and Lisa have prepared that will show the various projects and dollar amounts of where we stand today. Remember that none of these, this is not, we're not looking at an approved budget. We're trying to get to this so that as we go into the budgeting process, especially as it relates to capital, we can all be using this same tool and have a clearer understanding of the impact of all of the things that we would love to do the things that we need to do and the things that we can afford to do. All right. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Barry and let Barry give us a background on how the bond agencies and rating agencies look at our town, all the towns that they rate as it relates to our bond rating and the things that are important to them. So with that, maybe Barry, you could take the screen and we can go through this. All right? Sure.
Good evening, everyone. Just bear with me. My Zoom skills are not the best. Do you see a screen titled Town of Simsbury Credit Overview and Debt Analysis?
Yes.
You do?
So far, so good, Barry.
Okay, good. Well, good evening again. My name is Barry Bernabe. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. Worked very closely with Amy over the last couple of weeks trying to put this together. I know a lot of questions have come up. I sense in some of the questions a desire to get an exact amount of debt that is allowable to be borrowed. You know, kind of, in my words, kind of a black or white answer. This amount, not that amount. To me, though, as we go through this, I think it's going to be a little bit more of a shade of gray as to how much the town could borrow. Now, typically, when a community says, how much can we borrow? There's really three factors that determine how much a community could borrow. The first factor is the overall level of interest rates. Now, on page 2 here is a graph that shows the yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond that goes back over 53 years to 1968. If that's everybody can see that graph?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm sorry. So the story on page 2 is a good story, is that interest rates peaked in 1981. Long-term interest rates peaked in 1981 at 16%. Since then, they've bounced around, but the general trend has been downward. They hit an all-time low in March of last year when the pandemic started of under 0.5%. Today, the 10-year yield is on the 10-year Treasury bond is about a little over 1%. So it's up a little from its all-time low, but the story is from a historic perspective, rates are near all-time lows. So that bodes very well for any communities that are looking to borrow because rates are so low. Now, the second factor that determines a community's borrowing rate is just like any one of us. When we go for a mortgage or they look at our credit score. The higher your credit score, the lower your borrowing cost. The good news for the town of Simsbury is that both rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Standard & Poor's and Moody's, both rate the community AAA, which is the highest rating possible. So again, the first factor is the overall level of interest rates. The second factor is the town's credit score, credit rating, which is the highest possible. So those are two good beginning points. Now, what factors go into determining the community's bond rating? And basically, there's 5 assessment categories. The first is management practices, which comprise about 25% of the rating is assigned to management practices. A town's ability to have the fiscal discipline to plan, monitor, and manage their government finances. 1/4 of the rating based on that. The second is the economy and the demographics. That's 30%, the highest percentage. Now demographics take a long time to change. You know, you have wealthy communities and you have communities that are not so wealthy. Again, this is very favorable for Simsbury. The wealth metrics are very high. And the management practices are very strong. So factors 1 and 2 are very, very good. The third one that the community really has a lot of control over is financial performance. Basically, they look at fund balance. How much discipline does the community have to maintain an adequate level of reserves? And Simsbury's is relatively strong, not the strongest in the state of Connecticut, but healthy for a AAA rated municipality. We'll get into that in a little bit more. Number 4 is debt management. The rating agencies assign about 10% of their overall rating is assigned to debt management, the debt metrics, debt as a percent of budget, debt as a percent of grand list, debt per capita. And the last one, number 5, is long-term liabilities. Now, this is not so much of an issue for a community like Simsbury or many smaller communities, but for larger communities like a Hartford or Waterbury or New Haven, these long-term liabilities, pension and OPEB, which are basically healthcare retiree costs, and even for the state of Connecticut, these long-term liabilities are putting a lot of pressure on the operating budget and are becoming more and more of an issue from a rating standpoint for these larger communities. So on page 4, when communities say to me, what if our debt ratios go too high? Does that mean we will get downgraded? And the answer to that is not necessarily. I mean, if they get too high, yes. If they get too high and the town votes down budgets because they don't want to pay the debt service, yes, that could lead to a downgrade. But remember in the back of your mind that overall debt comprises only about 10% of the overall bond rating. So as long as your financial performance, your management team, your demographics all stay strong, debt by itself shouldn't be the only factor that pushes a bond rating up or down. Moving on to page 5 is a comparative credit overview. So we took all the AAA rated municipalities in the state of Connecticut, Avon, Bethel, Branford. I won't read them all, but you can see them all there. A few of them are rated one notch lower by Moody's, like North Haven and Stamford. But Standard & Poor's, all the communities listed on this page are all AAA. So this is a good comparative analysis to get a feel as to how well Simsbury relates to comparable communities throughout the state of Connecticut based on various metrics. So if we go to page 6, we see a little bit of a summary of the credit overview. The first one here is general fund balance as a percent of revenues. So Simsbury is about 15.2%, which is a healthy percentage. However, it's a little below the median. So of the 23 communities here, Simsbury is rated 12th, meaning it could be a little bit higher for a AAA rated community. For example, the town of Bloomfield recently issued bonds a couple weeks ago. They're rated one notch lower. They're AA plus. Their percentage of fund balance is 22.5%. So there are a number of communities out there that have a higher level of fund balance. Unassigned fund balance, again, Simsbury is rated 12th out of 23.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
I don't understand what the 2% delta is between the general fund balance and the unassigned fund balance. What 2% is assigned? And maybe that's a question for Amy. And what's it assigned to?
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, Amy. I know the unassigned is what I call the free fund balance. Sometimes some communities assign a portion of fund balance for use in future budgets or for capital needs.
Yeah, so the unassigned is basically you can use it at free will. The assigned is either some purchase orders that were left over from the prior year that got carried forward to the current year. So you can't spend that money twice. So that's included in assigned. Another thing that might be assigned is some of the items that, say, the Board of Finance approved at year end. So one of the items that I can think of off the top of my head is that we had unsettled contract negotiations at the end of fiscal year 20. And so that money that we had put in contingency, we needed to roll forward to 21. So that went in as a sign saying that we cannot spend that money. It's already there for a specific purpose.
Okay, thanks. I just didn't know what those unassigned purposes were. Thanks.
Gary, question. Are you using the OPM data for this comparison? Are these the most up-to-date numbers?
Yeah, because we're higher.
I am using the OPM, the state's OPM number. The only problem with that is that their data is somewhat old. This is actually 2018 data. Right. That's the most recent one the state has.
Amy, where are we currently at general fund balance and unassigned?
I think we're around like 16% at the end of Oh yeah, we're at 16%. The Board of Finance moved out anything above and beyond that to capital reserve fund.
And that's assigned or with unassigned?
So it moves it out into capital reserve. So within the capital reserve, it's unassigned.
So the 16% would be unassigned.
Right. I don't count, when I look at percentage of fund balance, I don't count anything that's assigned. It's all unassigned.
Okay, so then by using this terminology, the general fund balance might be even higher than the 16% because it includes some assigned stuff.
Yep, it could be. It's just stuff that'll be spent down. So I count it towards it because we can't use it.
And Amy, the debt service as a percentage of expenditures is what would be the current percentage?
We're currently within the 6.7, I believe. The board of, well, we're probably actually a little bit lower than that because we use the 6.7 for the cash to capital and the debt service. So I don't know off the top of my head, but I don't believe the Board of Finance changed it last year. So we're still within that 6.7% target.
Yeah, that's our policy goal, but we may well be below that in actuality.
Yeah, you're
right around 6%, right, of the budget. Now, again, some of this data is dated because it is from the State Office of Policy and Management. They have a long delay in putting all their data together, but at least it's apples to apples. You know, it's the same Simsbury it is for the other communities. Simsbury, some of these metrics could be higher, some could be a little bit lower, but it could be the same for the other communities too. So once that new data comes out, we could update it for 2019. But even using the 2019 data would be dated because the 2020 audit has come out for most communities. So there's always a little bit of a lag on some of this data. So just be aware of that. But it gives you a good kind of indication as to the community's strengths or weaknesses. Just to jump into it a little bit, on page 7 here is a graph of all the communities' total fund balance as a percent of revenues. So you want to be towards the right-hand side of the chart. So you can see on the far left is Stanford. Stanford's just above 5%. But some people might say, well, Stanford's rated AAA. They're only above 5%. That's very low for a AAA rated municipality. But Stanford has a grand list of close to $30 billion. And it's very robust, a lot of businesses, a lot of growth every year. So again, remember those assessment categories in the beginning. It's not any one doesn't control your rating. It's aggregate of all of them together. But the story here is you see Simsbury, but right in the middle of the graph. You're not in the lower end. You're not in the higher end. You're good, safe right in the middle for total fund balance as a percentage of revenues. So could fund balance go higher? Absolutely. Is it required to go higher to maintain the rating? No, it's at a healthy level right now.
Before you go on, Barry, one more question on page 6. You have one thing that says full value per capita, 146,000 in Simsbury. Is that the amount of debt per person or per household or something? What is that full value?
It takes the value of the property. So, if you have a piece of property worth 100,000, you're taxed at 70%, which is the assessed value. The rating agencies look at the full value. They reverse that 70% and gross it back up.
Okay, so this is the assessment.
Right. It's the value of all the property divided by the number of people. Now that's probably where Simsbury is the weakest, surprisingly. Now you say, well, they rank 18 out of 23. I think that property is very valuable in Simsbury, but when you include a lot of these lower Fairfield County communities with very high grand lists, so it just shows you, even though Simsbury is a very wealthy community, relative to other AAAs throughout the state of Connecticut, it is frankly not as wealthy as many of the other AAAs located in Fairfield County.
Right, for sure.
Barry, just to follow on that, what's Avon's?
Higher than ours.
We'll take a look. Let's see here. So unassigned fund balance is about right in the middle. We'll get to that in a second. I think I got a graph on there. But
all right. Thank you.
on the debt burden. Now, I know that this is critical. So we talked about the overall level of interest rates. We talked about the bond rating. The other good factor is where are your debt metrics right now? Are they high? Are they average? Are they low? And we'll see here that most of Simsbury's current debt metrics are towards the low side. Remember, you want to be towards the right-hand side here. So the lowest debt burden, which is the overall net debt, got a little typo in there, overall net debt as a percentage of your equalized grand list. So the lowest here is Greenwich. So Greenwich has the highest grand list in the state, and they have a relatively low amount of debt. That's why they're so low over here. They have a very low debt burden, Greenwich. So Simsbury's towards the right-hand side. So Avon is number 2, but Simsbury's overall debt burden is relatively low compared to other comparable AAAs throughout the state of Connecticut.
And Barry, that doesn't include that latest Henry James project because that happened after the 2018 numbers, correct? Okay.
Overall net debt per capita. Take your overall town's overall net debt divided by number of people. Simsbury is the 3rd lowest in the state, besides Avon. Now you see Greenwich now all of a sudden is in the middle of the chart. And I might say, well, how did that happen? So on a per capita basis, Greenwich's debt is much higher than it is relative to their wealthy grand list. So that's why there's a number of different metrics for debt that the rating agencies look at. Debt per capita, debt to how valuable your property is. But again, Simsbury has one of the lowest debt metrics in this chart for overall debt per capita. Debt service as a percent of your operating expenditures. So Simsbury was at about 6% here. Again, you're towards the right-hand side. Avon, Bethel, and Orange, and Hebron all have a very low debt service relative to operating expenditures. Now someone might say, well, how come some other communities are much lower? There's a number of other communities in Litchfield County and in eastern Connecticut where we could put it in where they're near zero. Now, people might say, well, that's great. But other people might say, well, they have no debt at all. They don't borrow for roads. They don't borrow for schools. They don't borrow for anything. They have no debt, many of these smaller communities. That by itself doesn't necessarily mean that its bond ratings should be higher. It just means they're not investing in their community as much as other communities are. But again, Simsbury, debt service as a percent of operating revenues on the low scale, on the low end. So again, very favorable debt metric.
Barry, can you go back to that and talk about best practices? I know GFOA and some of the rating agencies, S&P's, had 8 as a marker, and different ones have different markers. I know 10% you had mentioned earlier is you never want to go above 10%. Can you sort of speak to why that is?
Yeah, I mean, mostly what I see from Standard & Poor's, when we say to them, what is a high percentage for debt service as a percentage of expenditures? And what they come back with is 10%. They say, if we see that your debt service on an annual basis comprises more than 10% of your budget, they will use in the rating report that debt service is relatively high. If it's below 10%, say it's 7 or say 8 or 9%, they'll say it's moderate. And if it's below 8%, they'll say it's low. Again, if we look at the highest one here, it's Easton, Connecticut. Now, what I've seen in some of these lower Fairfield County communities, Easton, Greenwich, Stamford, even Cheshire, a lot of people that move to these communities want to invest in the schools, in the infrastructure, and the roads. And in my opinion, they don't care if the debt service budget goes higher or if the budget goes higher. That's why they move to that community. So sometimes you see in Easton they're at 16% of their debt service. Their debt service comprises 16% of their operating expenditures, which is very, very high. Now, some people may look at that and say, well, why aren't they downgraded? Again, there's other metrics there that mitigate that. So that by itself won't result in a downgrade, but it is something to be concerned about when it gets too high. And if people start voting down budgets, because if that happens, that shows that the residents are concerned that that's too high and they're not willing to pay that cost anymore. But if the debt goes high and the budgets continue to pass, that shows a willingness by the community that they're okay with the debt service going higher.
And Barry, just for members of the public who might not realize, debt service is directly tied to the mill rate. It's like its own department. So as you borrow more and pay more in debt service, the mill rate goes up unless there's an offset, either from the grand list or reductions elsewhere.
Correct. But again, just to recap on this page, Simsbury debt service as a percent of operating expenditures relative to other AAAs is towards the low end. So far, all of the debt metrics we've seen so far, Simsbury is relatively low. So equalized grand list per capita. Take the overall equalized grand list. And that word equalized, again, is because communities do revaluations at different times. It's not really a good comparison if one community just did reval and another one hasn't done it in 4 years. So the state computes this equalized number that allows you to compare grand lists from community to community. And no surprise, again, you see Greenwich by far has the wealthiest property in the state of Connecticut. And you see Simsbury here towards the left-hand side. So below that, you see Hebron, East Hampton, Tolland, Cheshire, and West Hartford. So it is a wealthy community. However, relative to other AAAs, especially in Fairfield County, it's not towards the right-hand side of the chart. It's more towards the left-hand side. Per capita income, Simsbury is towards the right-hand side, which is very good, even with these Fairfield County communities. So the per capita income in town is relatively strong. Again, no surprise, you see Greenwich at the far right-hand side. So that kind of wraps up the comparative analysis. I know I'm repeating myself a little bit, but just to recap, existing debt metrics for the town are relatively low. So we're in an environment where interest rates are low, town has a high bond rating, and your current debt metrics are relatively low.
Hey, Barry, just a question. Do you have the comparative mill rates as well?
I do not have that in here, but I could track that down out of the state's information and get that to you.
Thank you.
So the next factor, again, is the foundation that I call it, is that how does the community's existing debt profile look? So this chart on page 14 shows Simsbury's existing principal, interest, and total debt service payments, assuming you never borrow again. So you could see right now that total debt service is about $5.5 million for fiscal 21. Now, this column E here is the difference from 1 year to the next, the delta, assuming that the town never borrows again. So the good news here is it's all red. It decreases each year. So unlike my mortgage payment, which is the same for 30 years, doesn't change, municipality, because principal is repaid each year, the amount of interest decreases each year in column C. So the good news in column E is that if Simsbury were to never borrow, each year debt service drops off. So if you look in fiscal 22, debt service currently right now is scheduled to drop over $640,000 for fiscal 22. However, this does not include the proposed new bond issue that the town's planning on doing in a month or two. So just be careful with these numbers. But sometimes it works good. Like if you look way out in 2028, the town's debt service drops $1.3 million. So sometimes the timing works really good where there's a $1 million drop off in debt service and you add $1 million drop off in debt service. And someone could say, hey, wait a minute, we're borrowing all this money. What's that going to do to our budget? And if you hit it right, sometimes the answer is, well, it's not going to do anything to your debt service budget because you got $1 million drop off and you're adding $1 million. So net, you're going to stay even. So this is an important chart because that runoff in existing debt helps to mitigate future debt that's coming on. And just to look at that same data in a graphic format, here's what it looks like. These blue bars are Simsbury's existing principal and interest payments. So you can see that this arrow is your current level. So if you do nothing, it drops off each year. And this decrease, again, helps to mitigate any new debt that's lopping on. Very, very positive. There's many communities. The state law allows a lot of flexibility. When you do a bond issue, legally, you're allowed to skip the first two principal payments, and you could push principal out for future administrations to worry about. I never recommend that. Most communities in Connecticut don't do that, but there are several that do. So if you look at some of these charts for some of the lower rated communities in the state, it actually goes higher over time, even without borrowing. That's one of the reasons how Hartford got in trouble, because their existing debt, they restructured it so many times, they pushed it down, but then it just bubbled back up and they were unable to repay it in the future. That was a worst case scenario. Now we're all paying for some of those decisions that Hartford made.
Barry, when AAA's bond, what is their general bond length? I know we do 10-year bonding for most capital, and for schools, we've done 15.
I think Simsbury is on the aggressive side, is ahead of the curve. For most communities that I deal with throughout the state of Connecticut, when they borrow for basic town capital projects, they will go out 20 years. So if it's for a new town hall, like in Bloomfield, for example, they borrowed for a new Department of Public Works building. They amortized that over 20 years. So Simsbury amortizes their debt for town projects much quicker than most other communities. Very aggressive. Now for schools, Simsbury has been doing 15 years. Most communities do 20 years. Some of them have gone out to 25 to even 30 years for school projects. Now, sometimes I'm asked, is that right? It's a tricky question, because I was always told that, you should tie the useful life of the project to the bonding. So worst case scenario, your city of Waterbury would borrow for a police car that would last arguably 3 or 4 or 5 years, and they would pay for it over 20 years. That's clearly not right. But on the flip side, if you're building a new school, to amortize it over 15 years. Now, if that's the policy of the town, it's policy. There's nothing wrong with that. You really limit the amount of interest you pay over 15 years, whether if you did it over 20 or 25 or 30 years. But some people could say, well, from a generational standpoint, is that equitable? We're borrowing money today for a new school. I'm not an expert on this, but you would think that the school would last 20 to 30 years, maybe more, hopefully more. Should the people over the next 15 years pay for that? That's a decision for the town to make. And there are a few communities out there that do limit the term of their debt. In fact, Greenwich used to never borrow at all, which is hard to imagine. They would borrow, they would build new schools and they would finance it internally. But when rates got so low, even they said, well, we're going to go out and borrow because rates are so low. They limit their town projects to 5 years. And sewer and school projects, I think they go out longer. I'm not quite sure because we don't work with them. But again, on page 15, you could see how aggressive Simsbury's debt amortization is, which is very positive. So working with Amy, she gave me some information about the capital improvement plan with the Board of Ed.
So what year is this? What year are we talking? Is this 2018 data still?
Well, this is information that from the town of Simsbury now. So we've moved on from the
day, Linda.
So it's 2020 data.
Yes.
2021, 2020.
Uh-huh.
But this is proposed, Linda, not approved.
Right.
And so this is for the whole 6-year CIP.
Right.
Yes.
As of last year's CIP. Okay.
So
okay,
with the Board of Ed projects.
Let's be clear. What's in the CIP with Board of Ed? What Board of Ed projects are in there, Amy?
No,
157.6 million.
This is the CIP that we're starting from for the current fiscal year 22 budget that we're working on. So it includes the Tecton maintenance information that was provided for the board. And then it also includes the Board of Ed project, which would be the renovate as new for Latimer, and then the addition to the 6th grade at Henry James.
And so the difference, so that's only a difference of 45 million between, so those three things, maintenance, Henry James, and Latimer, you're saying are only 45 million?
No, so the maintenance is included in both because we need to maintain the buildings at the Board of Ed. So that's their new baseline for the Board of Ed. And then the only difference is the $45 million project for Latimer and the Henry James addition.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
when you look at these numbers, call it $158 million for CIP with Board of Ed, and without Board of Ed, about $113 million. Frankly, those are pretty large numbers. They're just looking at those, I know they're going to leave a mark. I mean, they're going to cause debt to go higher. So if someone were to say, well, can we borrow those amounts? Well, from a legal standpoint, when you look at the town's debt limitation, for schools, the town is legally allowed to borrow up to $363 million for schools. So legally, absolutely. Now the CIP without the Board of Ed is $113 million. You're legally allowed to borrow for town purposes $181 million. So yes, you have enough legal capacity to borrow for all those. Now, what would that look like if the town were to borrow those amounts? So it's a little bit busy here, but again, these blue bars on page 17, here's that existing debt service again. Now, it looks a little bit smaller because I had to change the axis because we're adding a lot of new debt on. So what this chart shows is existing debt, and then these color bars that are locked on are the proposed new bond issues in the future based on the CIP. And these lines here, like this brown line and green line and kind of a reddish line, represent percentages of the town's budget. So like this brownish line here is 7% of the town's budget growing at 2% a year. That's why it has an upward slope to it. The same with the green line is 8% of budget, and this red line is 10% of budget. Now, assuming the town were to borrow all that money in the CIP as it was detailed in the information that Amy provided, you would breach all of the budget guidelines over the next several years. What I'm assuming here is that school bonds, I actually assumed 20-year amortization. And for town projects, I assumed a 10-year amortization. And again, the only reason, if you said, well, why did I assume 20 for schools when they historically only do 15? It's just because I knew those size of those bond issues were so large that it would push the debt up. So again, visually, if looking at this chart, you could see debt would start at just under 6 million, and over a couple of years, several years, you'd be up over 60 million and actually peak at $18 million before it would start to drop off again. Now, the reason why it drops off again is because we're only looking at a 6-year term. If we were to look at a 10-year term or go out, I'm sure there's other projects in the future that would lop on top of that. So just to recap here, legally, could the town do it? Yes. Would you breach the 7% budget line? Yes. 8%? Yes. And even 10%? Yes. And your debt service would go from roughly 6 million to 18 million. So it'd go up by 3 times. And I guess you could compute, what that translates into as a mill rate increase over time.
We're going to do that. We're going to do that analysis in a minute, Barry. So.
Okay. So there's a visual of that existing and proposed debt service, including the Board of Ed projects.
So I'm just going to pause here for a minute and say this is very, very helpful, Barry. And I think the first 20 minutes of this, everybody's going, well, look at us. Look how good we are. Look how great we are. Look how much room we have. And that's all true. But it's based on the bright blue bar here and ignores the biggest elephants in the room. And so that's the purpose of tonight's meeting and these conversations is to figure out how to draw and quarter the elephant, I guess, or try to figure out how we get the elephant to fit into the room. And so we're gonna go on and use some additional tools and show you things in just a minute. But I wanted to say that Barry's right. These assessments of the bond rating and everything is based on a lot of things, and some of which we have traditionally done extremely well and continue to. But this one aspect of it is something that we really need to focus on. So that's why we're here tonight. All right, Barry, you can keep going. All right.
Very good. Yep. So just going on to page.
Peterson, can I ask a quick question?
Oh, sure.
Sure.
assuming it's okay process-wise. The 2% budget growth, though, there, Barry, where does that come from? Because is that our 10-year average? Is that our 20? Because I don't feel that's necessarily, to a certain extent, practical, at least not the way that I feel when I come out of these meetings a bit bruised and bloody at 2%. So how realistic is that number? That's my question.
Well, Chris, once again, you're right on top of this because Barry's about to show you the next slide where we put in 2.75%.
Right.
Show you the impact of that. All right.
So you're absolutely right. So on page 18 is the exact same graph. But in this one, I'm assuming that the town's budget grows 2.75% per year. Everything else is the same. Existing debt, proposed debt. It's just if you look at these lines, they grow at a quicker slope because we're assuming that the budget grows at 2.75. So that mitigates the impact to some degree. However, as you can see, the 10% of budget guideline is still breached for a number of years under this scenario, even with an assumed quicker growth in the town's budget.
But I have to make a comment on.
Yeah, I jumped on you, Linda. You go ahead.
I don't want to have folks go away thinking that the way to solve the capital crunch is to spend more money in the operating budget and therefore grow it faster, because then you're just hitting the taxpayers twice as hard. So
I was just going to say that the difference between the 2% line and this 2.75% line goes directly to the mill rate. So it's the total impact. And I think the slope of the line, though, to your question, Chris, I believe, doesn't increase swiftly enough to make the problem go away. The problem is real regardless of what we do. It does, and to Linda's point, it does compound what the mill rate has to be if the operating budgets grow at a high rate.
And I don't know if Chris's concern about whether 2% was realistic. Chris, you have to address this. Were you thinking that it wasn't realistic because it was too high or too low?
I didn't think it was realistic because it was too low. And okay. I was also trying to prove that, unlike high school, I did not read ahead and try to get the answers ahead of time. So I apologize.
Very good. So just moving on to page 19, it's a very similar graph, but we took out the Board of Ed. So no Board of Ed projects. These are just town projects. So you can see it does mitigate it quite a bit. However, when the budget grows at 2%, assuming the budget grows at 2%, the 10% of budget line is still breached for 4 years. And again, this is limiting the amortization schedules to 10 years for town projects.
Can I jump in here real quick? Just a question. Amy, can you educate me on the 112? Because that seems well in excess of my memory of the CIP I looked at last year.
So just a clarification on that one. These are the town projects in the Tecton maintenance. The maintenance was added to the CIP for the Board of Education in accordance with what Tecton said that we should be doing for maintenance at the Board of Ed side. Is remove the Latimer and the addition at Henry, the 6th grade addition at Henry James. It just removes the project. It doesn't the Board of Ed maintenance. So
no BOE is really no BOE expansion, but it still has BOE maintenance.
Correct. Yeah. Correct.
And again, remind me what the Tecton number is for debt for maintenance.
Oh goodness, it's like all over the board. I mean, like 1 year, I think it's like 19 million. So this is just what Tecton says that we should do for the next 5 years. These have not been vetted. Jason Casey, who's in charge of the capital over at the BOE, and Neil haven't gone through and prioritized projects yet. This is just straight from Tecton's presentation of this is what should happen over the next 5 years and input into the capital plan. Yeah. Okay. Just all I'm looking is I didn't want anyone to walk away thinking that the town side was proposing 112 million of CIP. I don't even know if we have 20 million in the CIP right now on the town side.
So Sean, it's not a true CIP because it hasn't gone through the vetting process and it's not in compliance with our policy. This is really a wish list CIP at this point. So it will be vetted. Every year we have a list of projects we want to do, and then we have to get it down to what we can afford to do. So it's still in the wish list phase at this point, what you're seeing.
Absolutely. And all I wanted to articulate, and I agree with you, is that the town government side does not have 112 million of capital projects.
Yeah, I was a little floored at that myself. I have to say, I didn't remember that. But I thought maybe it was, the town side has been working on this study for a couple of years, so of what its needs are going to be. Is any of that reflected in here? That's what I was assuming this was.
No,
we don't have that report yet.
So it may well go up substantially from what it is in our realistic minds now.
You got it.
Okay.
But I would just restate, this is Susan, I would just restate that these are not any Board of Ed renovations. This is strictly maintenance projects for our existing buildings. There's no bells and whistles here.
Fair enough. And again, we're reemphasizing that this is the total list that Tecton came up with. Unvetted, unprioritized, unnegotiated contracts, but we put all of that into this modeling effort just to see what the impact would be, Susan, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Just moving on to page 20 again is the same chart that shows town projects, again, with the Board of Ed maintenance, but showing the budget growing at a quicker rate each year, 2.75%. So you can see now by the budget growing quicker, it's the same amount of debt service the town would have to pay, but as far as a guideline, you're kind of right at that 10% number you hit at for about 4 years out in the future as the debt increases. Is it legal to do this? Absolutely. Can the town do it? Absolutely. But debt service would go from roughly $6 million up to about $15 million. So more than double over the next 4 to 5, 6 years. So just moving along here to a couple more charts. So assuming that the budget grows about 2% each year, I try to put in some estimates as to how much the town can borrow to stay under certain budget guidelines. And basically, if your budget grows at 2% a year, you could issue about $45 million over the next 5 years to stay under the 7% of budget line. If you say,
that's over 5. Yeah, that's not in year one. That's like spread across 5 years.
Right. Correct. And then if you say, well, how about if we go up to 8% of budget, that goes up to about $55 million. Now, these numbers are much lower than those wish list CIP numbers we talked about earlier. And assuming your budget grows at 2.75% each year, and you want to cap it at 7% of your budget, you could borrow about $52 million. Now these are estimates. It's hard to get it exactly.
But we asked him to give you. Right.
And this is also assuming the school projects are on 20-year terms?
Correct.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And
Barry, were you able to put together an extra slide showing 15-year terms?
I wasn't. I got preoccupied today. I apologize, but I could put that together and get that out to Amy over the next day or two.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. So 15 years for the school projects.
Does that include the 112 mil of maintenance, or is that not, Lisa, when you asked for that?
Well, just to show the graphs, the one thing we'll get to in the next charts when we do affordability, and Sean, that you and I have talked about in the past, is every year there's a request for way more than what the town can afford. And so we look at sort of the metrics and best practices of how we set our policies. And we'll go over that in the next chart to do that. And as Barry said, we can adjust our policies, but it's never a good idea to pass a policy and then decide you want to spend more money and then go back, oh, well, let's change the policy. Either the policy was good or it was bad. And you should, the that should guide us. But we can have that conversation because, to Barry's point, interest rates are very low right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All I was just clarifying was, is it the 157, or excuse me, the Board of Ed portion of the 157 in terms of the two buildings, or is it also the BOE portion of the 112 that you were looking for on 15 year?
That's a good question. So Sean is saying, what was included in the amount that was bonded for 20 years in your chart, Amy and Barry?
So it should have been the school project. So the school project should be the 15 year for the Henry James edition and the Latimer. And then all of the maintenance should be 10 year.
Okay.
That's what I did. So,
Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure we're all hearing or walking out with the same sheet of music. Thanks.
So the last chart I have here is to make things even more complicated a little bit, other considerations that could impact the town's ability. So I assumed that the interest rate on the bonds that the town issued for school bonds, which go out 20 years, would be 2.75. And for the town bonds, which go out 10 years, would be 2.25. And I think these are very, very conservative. For example, again, Bloomfield, which is AA plus, recently issued 20-year bonds at a 135, which is unbelievably low. So you might say, well, why are you using 2% for Simsbury? And again, because these bond issues will be in the future. Will rates stay at 1.3, 1.4%? I don't honestly know. It just seems unbelievably low to assume a rate of 1.35 for future bond issues. However, so the interest rate assumptions were very conservative in this analysis. If interest rates hold where they are now, those charts would all come down quite a bit because the interest rate would be lower. But again, there's uncertainty in the future. We don't know where they are. Southington just issued bonds today. They're AA plus also. They came in at a 145. So again, very, very low rate. So that's just an assumption to think about. Another factor that comes into play is that more debt could be issued if some of it was delayed. Like for example, using round numbers again, use Bloomfield again. They borrowed, I think it was $20 million for their Department of Public Works building. Now they didn't issue the $20 million right out of the starting gate. They said, listen, we can't spend $20 million that quickly. So what they did was they issued $10 million for the first year. And then the second year they issued the second. So they bifurcated the project. Now you might say, well, how does that help? You're still borrowing the total amount, but by delaying the borrowing, if you remember, your existing debt is dropping off. So as more of your existing debt is paid off, you could layer in more new debt with a lower impact. So that's something that was not taken into consideration in this analysis. The data that Amy provided based on those spreadsheets of the capital needs said, X amount of bond issue in this year, Y amount of bond issue in this year. That's when I assumed the bond issues were done. But there is some flexibility going forward to kind of, as I say, bifurcate that, split it in half, delay some of it, because I get the sense there is a limit, even in Stanford, that borrows a lot of money each year. Sometimes they say, we just cannot spend this money quick enough. We just don't have the infrastructure in place to spend it. So we're going to delay some of it. So something to think about. And the other thing is, historically, I don't see Simsbury issue what's called bands or bond anticipation notes. Not that I'm recommending that you do it at all, but other communities, most communities say, listen, we're building a new project. And I think in Bloomfield, again, they did the same thing. Where they started with the DPW building, they issued bond anticipation notes. So they got this $10 million up front. It's in the bank. They could start spending the money on the project, but all they're paying is interest on that for the first year. And then after the first year is up, they do a bond issue for a portion of it. So again, by doing that, you end up kind of dragging the impact of that project out over a number of years instead of it all hitting in 1 year. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And the final component, which we touched on already, again, I'm not recommending.
Can we just go back to that for 1 second? So where you have more debt could be issued if some of it was delayed. So Simsbury actually already delays it. So we start the project, we're basically in a negative cash position. We float our own cash and then we borrow against it. So we don't have bond money for projects sitting in the bank, so to speak. We start the projects, get into the project, spend the money, use our tax revenue, our unassigned fund balance, so to speak, to float the cash, and then we bond for it.
Wow. Okay. So that's good. So you fund it internally. So when you do your bond issue, you're really basically paying yourself back.
Exactly.
Yeah. And historically, we have not done any bans, and the prior Board of Finances have been adamantly against them. In a large part because of, I think, what Amy just articulated.
Right. Understood. And again, I'm not making any recommendations here at all. Just know, there was a point in time there where short-term rates got down, at like to 0.1%, like 0.2%. They were lower than a quarter of a percentage point. So again, I'm not making any recommendations, but some communities say, wow, it's almost free money. Instead of using our own money, we could leave that in the bank. Again, not that you're earning that much interest in there at all. Banks are not probably paying you that much. But if liquidity becomes an issue, just something to think about out there. But understood, it's not really something the town does. And just the final point here is that, and we touched on this already. We talked about school projects 15 years. I already assumed 20 years. But again, if it was a goal to kind of make the numbers work, to mitigate as much as possible, not that I'm recommending that, but you could amortize school debt for up to 30 years. So I know Farmington is contemplating a new high school to be built to go to referendum over the next year or two. And some of the scenarios prepared for Farmington show 20 years, 25 years, and 30 years to show how that mitigates the impact over various amortization terms. So the downside to that is you pay a lot more interest over 30 years than you would over 20 years than you would over 15 years. And again, if it's your policy to limit it, you made a good point, Lisa, earlier that you shouldn't just change it just to make something work. But it is something to that's out there that could possibly mitigate the impact of any future borrowing. So just to recap, this is it. 2 more minutes. The overall level of interest rates are very, very low. The town's bond rating is very high. Your existing debt is very low. Your debt metrics, your current debt metrics are low in general and low relative to comparable AAA rated municipalities. So as Robert, as you said, you're starting at a very, very good point. But some of these CIP wish list numbers are very high. And as you could clearly see from the charts, if they were to come to fruition, it would push the town's debt up quite a bit, maybe even 3 times higher than its current levels now.
And Barry, our current level is about 35 million total debt, and we're talking about 167. Is that right?
Let's see. So your current principal is about 30 million, about 35, 36 million of principal and interest, right? So when we say these CIP numbers, those are just principal. When you add interest onto those, so like the CIP without the Board of Ed is like 113 million. With interest, it's going to be much higher than that over the next several years.
So what total debt? Are we like quadrupling the debt or?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Those are some pretty big numbers. When Amy gave me those numbers, at first I thought she made a mistake or something, but it is going to, it would push the town's debt metrics up quite a bit. It would change it. Right. And is there something going on in town that is there like a certain need for massive improvements in the town's infrastructure? Different over the last 5 to 10 years?
I'll take a crack at that if from the Board of Ed side.
Go ahead.
So what the Tecton study reveals is that our elementary schools especially have aged at the same rate. So 5 elementary schools in town and very little capital has gone into them over time. So that you have 5 elementary schools with an average age of 75 years. And so those maintenance projects are related to aged elementary schools. And so, and we've talked about it too at the board, that depending on what you do with Latimer Lane being a priority project for the Board of Education, if you do a Latimer Lane project, many of those maintenance costs at Latimer Lane would come out, because you wouldn't need to do the maintenance projects if you did a large renovation project. So that's at least part of why that number is like something we haven't seen before in Simsbury.
But again,
just to add on a little bit to what Neil's saying, when we are discussing the terms of these bonds and I think it's important to note we have Squadron Line, 50-year building, never a real renovation to it. These buildings are serving us for long periods of time. So the terms of the bond are very interesting to me.
All right. Any other questions for Barry?
Barry, just to round out what I think was Lisa was asking, that prior slide shows our total indebtedness. Right. So that's the 18 plus the 36. Is that how I look at that?
So this on page 14 here that's on the screen is there's $30 million of principal in column B. And there's about $5.4 million of interest on that principal. So in total, the town's required to make about $36 million of debt service payments. So the remaining life of bonds that were already issued.
So then what was the 18 and the 36 that I was looking at on the legally obligated to spend slide, or allowed to spend? Because we're getting hit for 18 and 36 there.
So these numbers here, this debt limitation is based on state law. It's based on your total tax collections.
No, I get that. I guess am I reading that correctly? That that is implying 18.5 is out from the town side. Am I not looking at that correctly?
He's looking at the net indebtedness numbers.
Right. These are existing bonds that are outstanding. My numbers don't include the sewers.
Yeah, but I guess, so the school has 36 and the town has 18. That's more than the 36 is shown on the other chart.
Right now, this is dated a little bit, like I said. So the actual amount of debt is a little bit lower than what's reflected here. But this number here, I think you said, you mentioned that 18. Basically, what the state is saying is, from a legal perspective, you can issue up to $181 million on a legal basis.
I get purposes. That. I'm just fixated on I'm fixated on the difference between this chart and what we have outstanding, and where the 18 million is on the town side.
Do you know
if I do this, it's what, 54 million in total indebtedness versus 36 that your chart's showing. So there's an $18 million difference.
Does that include the Henry James issue?
Probably. Different year.
Yeah, I don't know what year Barry pulled the audit from. This information is in the notes of the audit. I just don't know what year he pulled it from. So it could be a difference of years.
So yeah, I understand the question. I thought I took it out of your 2020 audit. So again, the sewers are not included in my analysis. But
yeah, no, I agree. But 18 and 36, 54, right? And then we've got 36 on the other chart.
No, does that include your 21 issuance, Barry?
The other chart's 2018 data, though, and this is 2020 data, right?
The other chart was most up to date, right, Barry?
Oh,
yeah. The Excel spreadsheet I'm talking about. Yeah.
You know what? I'll look into that, Amy, and I could get back to you on that. I'll double check. See, you're right. They should be a little bit closer than that. It does seem a little bit high.
Yeah, and again, not being critical, I just want to make sure we understand. Again, I'm not suggesting that the 157 is where anybody wants to go, but contextually, are we at 50 or are we at 36? Because I think it makes a decision, or it gives folks perspective on how much are we doubling, are we tripling, or quadrupling, and that feels different depending on the starting point. And then Amy, if there's an historical, again, not that we want to go there, but when the high school project was on, what was our high? You know, what was the maximum amount of debt that we had out there would be interesting perspective as well. Not suggesting we make a decision off of it, but just, you know, again, what was the max this community has done?
Yeah, I can get that. We're actually doing the second half of the Henry James issuance actually this month with Barry. So actually, as soon as he has those amortization schedules, I think he sent me a draft. I can put that together and show you what the high is.
The historical high too, Amy?
I think if we go to the model that we have $51 million in fiscal year 22 as the total debt projected. But we'll get an answer for you, and we'll clarify this question about the 36 million total that Barry has on his previous slide, and then this slide. What is this, slide 16? Yeah. We'll get you the answer.
Yeah. I'm looking in your audit report. Your audit number ties out to my number, Amy. I just have to look into that statement of debt limitation.
Yeah, I can get it from the auditors to see.
Yeah.
I pulled it because this is their calculation. So
right.
I can to see where it's coming from.
I believe you guys. It's always the auditors that are wrong. So.
Hey. Barry, if you want to stop the screen share at the top, it should say stop screen share, and then I'll share the other. Yeah, thank you. And then I'll share the other Excel sheet they were going to look at.
Amy, before you show the second model, can you show, well, okay, that's fine. Can you go to the S&P best practices before we even start that tab? And Barry, if you could look at that, I don't know if you can make it better. Just to start with how we got to the 7% long ago, we used S&P, and this was from 2013, Barry, so they may not use that anymore. But a good way to analyze how much a town can afford in terms of debt service and overall debt load is like the sweet spot is you want to have under 30% to the operating budget of total debt and under 8% debt service. We have always been at level 2. I can't show that. Amy, can you highlight number 2, 13, the number 2? Yeah. No, go over to the 30 to 60. 2. This is where we've always been historically. We come in under 8%, which is why our debt service is 7. And sometimes occasionally we've gone a little bit over. But we've always tried to keep the total debt around 60. And what Barry is saying is that we can actually take on quite a bit more debt. But the more you take on more debt and the higher your debt service, like go down to the bottom right, number 5, you don't want to be there because then you've got a high debt service and a high debt load. So to Barry's point, that's sort of one way to think about what we want to do as a town. So that's sort of the background as to how we got to 7% debt service. And we just reaffirmed that in September, and that's been our number for the last 20 to 30 years. And so the first question is that the right number? We can answer that later. But now if we go back to the data model, Amy, and if you could just go down to the benchmark part and just highlight the benchmark part so people can see that.
This is a really tiny print.
You just need to see that. You can condense the other stuff if you want. Because we just want to look at the benchmark right now. And so the benchmark, what we did is said, okay, well, what is our 5-year projections going to look like if we use current benchmarks? Knowing that they're not necessarily realistic. And so we chose the operating budget growth at 2.5%. And we used that because that was between 2 and 2.75. And 2.5 is sort of the cap in Massachusetts. To Chris Peterson's point, we know that's not going to happen, given the projections. It might be higher. But let's call that the benchmark. And then we use the current grand list projections. And if you take a look at those, Amy, can you highlight line 29? You'll see that our grand list actually is projected to contract in 2024. So the grand list growth, when we think about where is the town heading, the projections are very poor. And this was
Can I ask a question? How does are you saying the growth per year is contracting or the total grand list is contracting?
This in 2024 under item I, Amy, the total number would contract.
Yeah.
That's the amount of revenue from the grand list goes down that year.
And so
the previous year.
How does that happen? Are houses being raised, businesses being imploded?
It happens on a reval year. So you'll notice your mill rate reset.
Yeah.
So, but the point is, you'll see the numbers are pretty low. Amy, none of them go above 2%. Is that right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. So that sort of sets the stage. And then line 30 is our current policy, debt service at 7%. And so if we take that, what we know, well, what are our 5-year projections on the mill rate? Just if everything was at the benchmark. We would start from a 38, I think 23, right, Amy? Is that where we are? That's all right. Well, we're projected to go next year at 38, 31. And by K, which is 2026, I think, you're looking at a 41.63. And what does that mean for the average taxpayer? Well, we start out we looked at 3 tiers at 305, 400, 500. What does that mean to the average taxpayer? And after 5 years, you're looking at, for the 300 house, about a 462 increase. For the $400,000 house, a 605 increase. And for the 500 house, it's about 756-year increase in taxes over the 5 years. And given that we love this town, that's probably okay, right? But to Chris's point, we know that we're probably going to be higher than 2.5%. So it's going to be just, even if we do nothing else, that's where we are. So now go all the way to the top, Amy, if you would. This scenario is if we did everything that was on the wish list CIP, so the 2 school buildings and the Board of Ed maintenance. And you take a look at the difference between what the mill rate does and where we end up. Instead of going from 8,192 to 8,654, we're going to go to 10,439. And that's about a 2,245 increase over 5 years versus 400. The next number down for the 400,000 house, that increase, instead of being,
it's about 3,000.
It's going to be $2,940 increase. And going down to the $500,000 house, instead of being a $756 increase, we're looking at a 3,600 increase. So instead of looking at, for normal growth, a 5.6% increase in the mill, we're looking at a 27.43% increase. And so that, to Barry's point, can we afford it within the debt capacity? Yes. So that's the first thing we look at. The second is, can we afford it? Can our residents afford it?
Lisa, what's the term of the bond you're modeling? I'm sorry.
We did 20. That's 20.
Okay, thank you.
So just in terms of like the magnitude of the tax increase is really unprecedented. And given that in comparison with the grand list growth projections, although I think Maria said they may perhaps be better than what we were given in November, but we're going to use the conservative numbers and we can only use what we have right now. But this then becomes the challenge and why it becomes so hard, because someone paying $3,675 more in taxes, that stays there. That's there for good.
Cars. And that doesn't even count the cars.
And that does not count the cars, correct. So that, I think for a lot of us, that's why the CIP that we saw, the 167, is really a wish list. And we need to go back to our best practices. So should it be 7%, 8%, 10%? I don't know what other members of the board feel, but I'm probably not comfortable going above 10. Certainly not for a few years, but more than a few years. But two things I'd just point out. If the operating budget is increasing, there are two ways. If you decide you want to do a lot of debt, we could say to you, okay, can you keep your operating budgets down to 1.5? And then we can increase the debt service number. From what I just heard from Chris and looking at school population projections, I don't think we're going to be able to do that. And so there's not going to be an offset from the grand list. We're probably not going to be able to keep the operating budget down. So that means we're probably going to have to look at limiting the debt service. Now, that said, there are many ways we can do this, and Barry can help us figure out, prioritize. But the first parameter is sort of, well, how much are we comfortable borrowing, given the best practices that are out there? And we just in September reapproved 7%, and that's what it's been for 20 years, or 30 years, as long as I can remember. And then the first question is, should we go higher than that? And that's one of the things Rob's going to lead a discussion on. The second one, to Kevin's point and Linda's, should we be borrowing at 15, 20, or 30-year terms? And to Barry's point, you do, those who use it, there's an equity thing, should pay for it. On the other hand, the other sort of moral issue you look at is those of us who approve it today are going to tie the hands of elected officials tomorrow, and we're going to be putting this debt on the next generation. So there's a plus minus for both ways to look at it. And so I just wanted to throw those out there. And Rob, let you pick up a little bit on where you want to go with this.
Yeah, so I think what we've tried to demonstrate tonight is that the important thing to consider is, first of all, I think we need to take a hard look at the list, the wish list of the CIP. And that's, I think that's for both the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed to do. Look at those maintenance projects. And Susan, I completely hear you that we've deferred maintenance for a long time. These are not just luxury things, but we need to look at what they're recommending, when it needs to be done, and what the real price should be. All right. We should look at the major steps in the projects, both Board of Ed and Board of Selectmen, and see when they should come on. Because this, the chart where they go way above the 10% line is a function of how quickly we take that debt down and how little amortization there actually is in the period that we're looking at. I mean, you go out 6 years, there's very little of the debt that we borrow when you're borrowing $20, $30 million in each of your debt years that is repaid. I think we should look at the term of the specific projects, but be real about this balance. I think Barry brought up actually a good point today, which is, and it's a counterpoint to what Lisa just said. Is it fair to put debt burden for 30 years, by the people that are on these boards today, for people 20 years from now? But I think it's equally challenging for us to say we're going to build a school that's going to last us 30, 40 years and ask the people who live in town over the next 10 years to pay for it, and for the benefit of others. So I think the term term of the bonding is important. I think that the more important is the spacing and timing, and then most importantly is the total list. I know that there are members of our board, and I'll ask each of them to speak to this, that are firmly on the 7% debt policy, and how important it was for us when we reaffirmed that. It has been a policy of the town for a long, long time. But when you're building something new and big, maybe you need to go beyond that for some period of time. But I'm also with Lisa. I don't think we should put ourselves in a position where we're above 10% of the operating budget. So I'd ask for feedback from other members of our committee that you want to share, and then I'll ask for reaction from both of the boards that are represented here tonight, Board of Ed and Board of Selectmen.
Hey, Rob, it's Kevin. I know that as part of my campaign was to kind of keep that 7% debt to service level. I'm pretty comfortable with the 7%. I think one of the other things we discussed was the term. I'm comfortable increasing it for the school projects. I think they did it for the high school to 15 years. You know, I might consider going to 20 years on a term for school projects.
This is Linda, and I'm not uncomfortable about having a longer term for the school projects, 20 years, given that it's going to be a project that's useful, not just for the maintenance things. I think a lot of plain maintenance things probably don't deserve a 20-year term, if you're replacing, but it has to go along with the life of the item. If you're replacing a boiler that lasts 20 years, then okay, I wouldn't have a problem with it. But if it's only going to last 10 years and then have to be replaced again, then obviously that's not appropriate. The concern I have about the 7% versus 8% or 10%, I mean, 10%, forget it. I'm never going there. It will be a stretch to get to 8%, in part because, and correct me if I'm wrong, Amy, I don't think we're even at 7% now. I think our policy is 7%, but we're actually at 6 point something. So we're already looking at a big bump. You don't go up to 7% from 6.5 or whatever we are. Even if we stay within the policy, we're adding a big bump in the mill rate. So if we bump up a lot more than that, then that really has a big impact on taxes. So I think we have to kind of look at all of that stuff before I feel comfortable making a statement. But we did just reaffirm the 7%. So, and there was no objection to it from any quarter. So I'd be hesitant to go higher than that. I suppose it's conceivable you could drag me to 8%. With proper inducements, chocolate, things like that.
Derek?
Yeah, I just want to apologize for getting on a little bit late, but I think as we're trying to eighth of a point by eighth of a point reduce the rate on our unfunded liabilities, which actually goes in the opposite direction. You've got are wanting to borrow more. And I'm, hey, look, we're in an environment where interest rates are going to be lower for longer. So it's a really good problem to have that, we can borrow at such low rates. And then also given, kind of our standing with the rating agencies, that those are both really good guys, I think, in terms of, borrowing today. I'd prefer 20 years is a long time for me, 15, 20, maybe on select projects. But what I'm probably a little bit more comfortable doing is trending towards. And so again, we take these eighth of a point or quarter point moves year over year to get to our ultimate goal. I would suggest we take a measured approach in how we ramp up our borrowing. I can't, if you look at how the banks deal with when they borrow, as they borrow more, they reserve more. And so it would go without saying that I would be looking for, some level of increased reserves as our increased borrowing went up. That would be consistent with, any lending program out there. So those are kind of my thoughts. I'm okay with, feathering up the rate and maybe getting to 20 years. That's on the longer end for me. But also having a discussion about, how we're reserving as well.
Thank you, Derek. Art?
Yeah, I'm finding it sort of like what your final position is going to be. And I've learned so much tonight. I want to build some equivocation into my comments, frankly. I do have some observations to make. One is that this is both a time of very low interest rates, but also a difficult time for a mill rate increase for the town. I mean, those both go together. We did 7%. It's something the town has invested an awful lot of credibility in. It's a standard I think we got to think long and hard about violating that, but it's there and it's important. Now, we need new school buildings. I think that's clear. I could go to 20 years on school buildings, but it comes to me that this is for interest rates, and given the need for school improvements, it's a good time to borrow, but it's also a very good time to constrain the operating budget. I mean, to me, that has got to be part of this. I mean, as we said before, the level of salary increases cranked in are business as usual. And to me, that conflicts with the need to borrow for these schools. And so those are my thoughts.
Rob?
Lisa?
Thanks to everyone for adding your thing. I'm at 7% because we just approved it, and I don't want to be like Mitch McConnell. I have one standard when I'm in power and a different standard when I'm not. It should be the same standard. But that said, because interest rates are so low, and given Barry's presentation, like Linda, I could be talked into 8%. I'm hesitant, like Derek, to go beyond 15. I mean, Kevin, to go beyond 15, but I could be talked into 20. But those are sort of contingent to Art's point, is where are we going to find savings elsewhere? If you think of the debt service as just another department, the debt service department, if we're going to go up on that, what other departments are going to go down so that we can moderate the mill rate increase? To me, it is unacceptable to do a $2,250 mill rate increase, $3,600 mill rate increase. That's just not going to work, to Art's point, given the current economic condition that the town is in. So I'm at 7 to 8% debt service, 15 to 20%
years.
Yeah, time of, and then I would just encourage, the Board of Selectmen, who will get the Board of Ed's request, to work closely with Barry and come up with a funding scheme and say, okay, this is what we can afford. It really, it's sort of understand the needs, but you also have to balance that with the affordability and what can we afford right now. I know Barry showed unemployment. It's actually at 5% right now. It was 7% at the height of the pandemic. I personally know, of 5 friends, 2 have lost their jobs. 1 got a new one. He was in his 30s. The one in his 50s did not. And 3 friends are working more hours for less salary. So the unemployment doesn't reflect, I think, some of the hardship out there. So I'm not sure if Wendy's on the call, but Wendy and Sean have mentioned that they want to keep the mill rate very flat. And given the current economic conditions, one of the things you have as an option is, if we go above the 7% or even the 8% for a year or two, we can do a mill rate stabilization fund. You have in the debt service reserve, the capital reserve fund, about $2.5 million. Instead of spending that, we could designate that money for mill rate stabilization in the years when we're high on debt service. So that's another option you guys have. But I guess the bottom line is we have a lot more projects that we want to do than we can afford to do. And that happens every year. When I was on the Board of Selectmen, projects would come in 3 or 4 times higher than what we could actually do. So that's where it's going to come into prioritization. You guys can make the other boards can make your recommendations. Just ask, I really encourage you to prioritize them. So if we get to the point to cut, we know what your priorities are.
All right. So I maybe go to Susan. I think Neil must have dropped off, but just for a reaction.
Yeah, no, Neil had to jump off. We have an executive session, so he's tending to that while I'm still with you all. I would, I appreciate all your feedback and understand that policies are put in place for reasons, but I also think that as times change, policies sometimes need to change with them. And given the low interest rates and the opportunity we have to move this long range forward, this long-term plan forward, which is something you all asked us to do, I would like to see that really considered for what it is. We have great need at Latimer Lane. We are coming up against some enrollment issues. So these projects do need due consideration. I appreciate the idea of the flat mill rate. I'm a taxpayer in town. My kids are out of the school system. I have a husband who very fortunately just got a new job. So I'm the person you're talking about in many situations. And do I want the kids that move to this town to have the same opportunities minded? Certainly. And do I see the need in the buildings? I'm in them often. Absolutely. So it's a balanced conversation, certainly, but I think it's one I'm anxious to move forward.
Susan, could we get from you guys a 5-year projection on your expenditure budget, what you're projecting?
I do not have that in front of me, Lisa. I'm sorry to say I don't have my budget book yet this year. We're getting them at our meeting on Tuesday, which would help give me that information.
Yeah, you can just do it when you give it to us, because it would be helpful to know, boy, we're expecting population to increase or something. And so our operating budgets are going to go much higher than 2.5, because that will impact how much debt service we can have. Or if you come in and say, oh boy, we're in good shape operating, so that gives us capacity and debt service. So it would just be helpful to get some projections on the 5-year. And again, for the Board of Selectmen as well. But I think we have those.
Well,
sorry, I think we can certainly get that for you. And as I say, we've had a lot of increased enrollment coming our way through a lot of the development in town. So and there's been home sales of late. So we
want to make sure you can meet your operating budget and pay your teachers. I assume that's your top priority, right?
Always.
Well, we know what the projections, their projections, their guesses. I would like to take apart these two discussions. One is a capital improvement discussion. Another one is an operating. I don't want to link these two at all. Back to Art's point earlier, there needs to be a reduction in operating. I don't want to use our capital improvement plan as a carrot for negotiation, because it'll get thrown out the window after year one. Because the realities will, the rubber will meet the road every year in terms of what we actually need from an operating standpoint. So right. I'd really just try and keep these discussions separate in my opinion.
Yeah, I would echo that.
That's fair, but I think they are interactive. I think the difference is that this year we're actually giving the capital discussion a lot more emphasis and detail than we have in the past. So, I think you're right, Derek. Again, we do appreciate the long range plan that was initiated at our request and others' request, and it was designed not just to recommend building new buildings, but also to be more efficient and deliver better education, all the rest of that, which is all the long-term goals. And then we come around full circle to the operating capital, operating savings as a result of all of this. So I guess what I'd like to do is say, I hope we provided meaningful context. Actually, I should, before I do that, listen to Eric or Maria respond, and I apologize.
All right. Thank you. I thought the presentation tonight told an excellent story, and I just wanted to underline that. I think that we should, continue to have a serious conversation about all the levers we have. I would personally be willing to consider longer terms to some of these loans, especially when it's appropriate, like a school building. Looking at raising the debt service line modestly closer to 8% is something that I think we should consider. And then also potentially delaying some of these really large capital projects, even a very modest amount of time can help smooth that line. So I think that these are all conversations. And I think that as we go through the budget process, it really underlines the need for, I think, the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed to be tied closer than perhaps we've been previously.
So,
I agree with that, Eric.
Yeah, completely. Maria, did you want to add anything, or?
I think Eric did a great job. Thank you, though.
Okay. So I think the task at hand is right in front of us. I know you guys are working hard on your operating budgets, but I think what Eric just suggested and Susan agrees is where we need to be. We need to do a very, very deep dive on that list that adds up to 112 or 157 million and say, what are these really hard numbers? What should be in, what shouldn't be? When should it happen? I think you've seen some flexibility on our part relative to 20 years for long, up to 20 years, 15. Kevin's kicking me under the table, but 15 to 20 years for real long-term capital like the school buildings. I think you've seen some willingness to consider debt service growing from the 7% policy perhaps to something like 8, but not 10 or over. I think we do have a few other things we can do, which is to, if you spread these things out, look at the capital reserve, the mill rate stabilization type fund, which will help in the really off year, really very high years. I don't know who just said it, but the real problem here is that each of these projects is large. And if we were doing one of them, it would be easier. It's when we do the second one and the third one on top of the maintenance ones that the problem really starts to compound. So let's scrub the list, work together between the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed, present to us, reasons operating wise, student population wise. We'll be looking at making sure we have realistic right projections for the mill rate, for the grand list and the like, but these are on the margin. And just remember not to be Debbie Downer, but we have other things that we need to do as a Board of Finance, like the pension liability and some other things that are going to be also headwinds as we go into trying to come up with a budget that maintains a low increase in the mill rate. Very, very difficult time for all the reasons we discussed. But we hope we've given some good context for that. I'm glad to have any of us reach out to any of us to discuss and see if we can work cooperatively to get to a solution that we can all live with. All right?
Rob, I just have one more thing to add.
Okay.
I am not, in my mind, pulling apart the operating from the capital because they both go to the mill rate. And what I'm hearing is that there's no way we can keep our operating budget under control. And I'm going to be reluctant to raise the debt service above 7. So to me, they are related because they all go to the mill rate and that goes to affordability. I may be the only one who views it that way, but.
No, I certainly see it that way.
Yeah, just so we're clear, I didn't want, we're agreeing that on these large projects to then say, okay, yeah, well, we'll keep our operating budget in check. That's what I didn't want the discussion to go there, just for clarity.
Yeah. I heard what you said, Derek, the same way.
Okay.
Yeah. Not that you were advocating that if we could get one, we don't have to do the other.
Precisely. No, I'm not saying that at all. We should get, really any tax increase this year is unacceptable. We know that. And that said, there's probably going to be a tax increase.
Yeah.
But that's a very hard position to be in.
It is. It's going to be very difficult. But we have to look at all of our realities at the same time. All right. I appreciate this. I think it was very helpful, very productive. Look forward to seeing how this all filters in as we go into the budget. Hearing your budgets, and the next February is upon us. So how did that happen? I don't know. Here we are. All right. We have a few more agenda items. I'm going to move on to those. Next up is the approval of the minutes. There's been one suggested edit that's been made from one of Lisa's comments. Did that get covered with the group?
I got a couple if I could, Rob.
Sure, please.
The first paragraph, Mr. House asked Chairman Pomeroy if there was any concern, I think it should be singular, reported from the meeting that prompted the discussion in which Chairman Pomeroy denied. It's garbled. I'm not sure quite what you meant, but it's a garbled sentence, and however you want to make sense of it is fine with me. Let's see. I had two others. One is it's actually on line 118, 117 under agenda planning. Ms. Hevner added that they want to ensure affordability for the taxpayer and explained as they take on more debt, it increases the bond rating.
Art, I sent in the change.
That's the edit we made. We fixed that.
Okay, fine. And then just under adjournment, Mr. Pearl made a motion to adjourn. Chairman Pomeroy seconded the motion. Well, obviously that's wrong because it's not legal for you to do that. So either we can take out, Mr. Mill made a motion to adjourn. It was seconded in the media adjourn, but
all right. I'll send, I don't know, Marion, are you going to edit these, or do we go back to Amanda? I think it was who did these.
I'll do the edits for this one because she's not.
Okay, I'll send you 2 marks tomorrow, Amy, and then fixing what Art suggested. And I think the gist of it is correct. The words need to be fixed with the edit that Lisa made.
Can you also just take a look at line 69? And I have no idea what it was attempting to say, but it it says it was explained that ICMA is up to the times. I don't know what that means.
I had that as well. I just you're absolutely right. I mean, I didn't make any sense out of that, but I wanted to just note a few priorities.
I'll make those changes and I'll send along another draft.
All right. Shall we conditionally approve these minutes? Is that advisable?
Yeah, I mean, if you and Amy can just draft, makes sense. I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
All right. So I need a motion to that effect.
I move that we approve the minutes upon contingent upon them being edited for sense.
And I'll second that.
Good. All right. Thank you.
We're going to vote.
Finance Director's report.
Are we going to vote on that?
Oh, all in favor, say aye.
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 Thank you, Art. Finance Director's report.
So under the grants and donations, the only thing I wanted to point out here is that one of them is a tentative grant. As you can imagine, it's the one for the Meadowwood Barns. So in the event that the town proceeds with the purchase, there is a grant that would provide a structural analysis of the barns. Again, this is contingent on the town actually moving forward with the project. This is not committed as of yet. Down under the financial update for COVID, so just on the town side, we have about $87,000 in COVID expenditures to date. We have actually received $26,000 from the state based on reimbursement, another $13,000 related to elections, and then about $8,600 for elections. That was a private grant. We also received, this is something new since last time we met, $181,000 in state funding. So the $26,000 was previously based on a reimbursement grant. We had to provide them all of our invoices, purchase orders, et cetera, and then they reimbursed us based on their analysis. For the $181,000, they actually did it on a per population formula. So it's no longer reimbursement. So as you can see, the 181,000 far exceeds what we've spent thus far. So they've actually changed the parameters of the program so that we could use the money on expenditures for police salaries and public health. So I think Maria was in touch with the health district, and they did anticipate coming back for an additional appropriation. So we're waiting to hear back from them. And then also, before I move on to the Board of Ed, we'll be doing the quarterly financial report update at the next meeting for both the Board of Ed and the town. So we'll have a better sense on where we are, where we think we're going to end up at the end of the year overall. And then Maria will have a chance to touch base with the health district to see if they will come back and make a formal request. Otherwise, we can put together the anticipated savings related to that money and see if there's a proposed designation for it.
So, Amy, real quick, the COVID number, the 181 plus, it looks like the 26, was that all from the December kind of Fed relief for COVID? Is that part of that?
So the 26,000 was for the period ended June 30th. And then the 181,000 is for the period ending December, which after we put this together, they actually changed it from December 2020 to December of 2021. So we do have until the end of this calendar year to use those funds.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. And then on the Board of Education side, we have about $845,000 in COVID expenditures to date. There has been a series of fundings. We had $375,000 in state funding, $266,000 in year-end savings, and then we were able to use a little bit of capital money. We actually just heard on January 11th that there could be another funding source coming through the state, so we're waiting to hear back on that. And then anything that's not covered under that, we still have our $385,000 in non-lapsing that we would be able to utilize to cover those costs. And then under the proposed amended purchasing policy, this is just something that came up during the audit. There were a couple of requirements that the auditors were looking for us to add into our policy in order to be in compliance with our federal grant awards. So in order to spend any federal grant money, they have specific procurement policies that we need to adhere to, and they want to make sure that their policies are incorporated into our policy. So it's literally those 4 items that are stated there in the finance director's report, the statement of responsibility. They wanted to ensure the pre-qualified list for current, free, and open competition, assurance that small and minority and women's businesses are used when possible. And then they want us to have a independent cost or price analysis before going out to bid so that we have something to compare to. So this will be going before the Board of Selectmen at their January meeting for approval. And then the final item is the approved abatement. This is something that the Board of Selectmen approved at their last meeting on January 11th for Hot Meadow Street. And it includes a copy of the approved abatement schedule. I'm not super familiar with the abatement of the specifics, so Maria is here to answer if you have any questions related to that.
Do we have anything we need to do to this? This was the Board of Selectmen's decision. We don't get to say yes or no. We already talked about this before.
Right. Yep.
I feel compelled to go on the record in saying that just because they are doing well and spending more money and buying more equipment, we're going to give them even more tax breaks. I don't know why. I have a hard time with how this ended up, the split between the total tax that is growth and how much of it was abated. So this is a topic for going forward, and it has nothing to do with Ensign Bickford or the company or anything else. It's just in general. That is just one more. It's another $200,000 of tax we would otherwise have been entitled to that has been abated, and will have to be spread out among the 20,000 people who live in town and pay taxes. So I don't know.
Yeah. I totally agree.
It's felt compelled to say that. I don't know.
I totally agree.
But it says we have to the extent that we do any more of these, which again is, I think, up for debate, we should be very careful about what we grant. We granted them a tax rate for each of the years, not a dollar amount. And so that is going up. Anyway, for what it is.
I concur.
Yeah, at 100%. Yeah.
So I would just add the one role the Board of Finance does is how we budget that and how we show that in the budget. And I sent Amy an example from Norwich, how they do it. So we'll work at a way to put that as an either foregone revenue or some way to list it so that we can be transparent. And I know that was a priority of this board and also the EDC. So we can work that. And that's just literally a simple line item addition in the budget. So we can figure out how to do that.
Okay. Linda.
No, it's okay. I am just piling on.
Point made. Points made. Thank you for the update on the building report. And I think that will do it for tonight. And even though I won't second it, I would ask somebody to make a motion that we adjourn.
I move that we adjourn.
For Art.
Art
seconded it, even though he was on mute. I want the record to show that Art.
I second it.
All right. Good meeting, everybody. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.